I'm Mike Loudon. I'm the CEO of the Milken Institute. We're delighted to have you join us on this very special occasion. Before we get going, let me just fill you in on a couple of upcoming events. A reminder that our annual State of the State Conference is going to be held on October 28th at the Beverly Hilton. We have a limited number of seats still available, still few, if you register this week. It's going to be a great event. If you go online at milkeninstitute.org, you will see the incredible list of panelists that we have, very interesting topics. There's never been a more interesting time to talk about the issues facing the state of California. Also, for those of you who are Milken Institute associates, we do have two upcoming breakfasts, one of which actually is sold out, but just a reminder for those of you who are signed up for it. Continuing our discussion tomorrow, we're going to have on politics, Frank Luntz is joining us to talk about the upcoming election and off-the-record discussion for our Milken Institute associates tomorrow morning. And then our next Milken Institute associates breakfast is going to be on November 13 with Mac McClarty, who was, many of you may know, was President Clinton's chief of staff, is got a great deal to talk about, not only in terms of politics, but in terms of world economy and business. He'll be joining us on the 13th. Again, that's only for members of the Milken Institute Associates. Any of you who are interested in joining, contact anyone here on the staff. Our next forum is going to be on November the 12th. We're going to have Sam Wiley here, the legendary business person. And Sam's going to be talking about his new book, $1,000 and an Idea, Entrepreneur to Billionaire. We hope that the latter category still holds true for Sam in the last few weeks, and not the opposite. And Mike Milken is going to be interviewing Sam for that. So that should be an interesting event. That's November the 12th. Those are all the announcements I have to make, which are really designed to make sure as many of you as possible get in your seats before we get going. Those of you who know me from the Global Conference know that I'm really just filler. So happy to do that. We have a couple of requests for you. First, if you have any cell phones, please be sure they're either off or on vibrate. We'd appreciate it if you would do that. Anyone who turns on, whose cell phone rings and they stand up and say, "Oh, just a minute, I'll take it outside," will be tackled by one of the people over there, so I suggest you don't do it. The other is we want to make the same request that is typically made at the presidential debates. No hissing, no catcalls, polite silence, no applause, hold the applause till the end. We really want to let we really want to let our participants have a chance to have the discussion. So please, polite silence would be appreciated. And at the end of the discussion, there will be ample opportunity for questions. When it does come time for the question and answer session, our normal rule applies. Questions, not speeches. So please restrain yourself when that time comes. Okay, without any further ado, let's get started. I'd like to introduce our moderator, who will in turn introduce our speakers. Peter Purcell is one of the great gems of the Milken Institute. He has for the past 10 years now, is that right, Peter? Been the editor of the Milken Institute Review. For those of you who have read it, you know it is one of the most readable journals of economics produced anywhere in the world. It's a great publication. For those of you who haven't read it, I urge you to go online, look at it. You can get a subscription or look at it online. It is really terrific, and it's really thanks almost entirely to Peter. Peter is a senior fellow of the Institute. Before joining the Institute 10 years ago, he was economics editor for the New York Times. And before joining the New York Times, he was a professor of economics at Columbia. And he is totally nonpartisan, unbiased. And I want to point out, because I just realized it now, there is no political statement meant by the fact that I'm wearing a blue shirt and tie tonight. I'm going to be sure to wear a red one tomorrow. So, Peter, I turn it over to you.
Well, thank you. I'm echoing. Is anybody else echoing?
You're echoing.
I'm definitely echoing. Do we want echo? Is echo okay? Okay. Well, Let me tell you how we're going to do this. I'm reluctant to call this a debate because I think we won't get nearly as much out of these folks if it's a debate, as opposed to a dialogue, a discussion, something on that order. So I'm going to try to keep it as informal as possible. Each of the two speakers is going to have 6 minutes at the front end, like a real debate, to say whatever they feel like without any response right then and there. After that, I'd like them to start responding to each other to what they've said in that time, and I will intervene with more questions when it looks like it's time to get more questions in. Don't worry, I'm going to leave you 20 to 30 minutes for questions of your own. And again, let me repeat, no applause, no hissing, no booing, an occasional quiet chuckle's okay, but that's about it, okay? Well, okay, let me introduce the speakers. To my left, though, to your right, which is more appropriate, is Michael Boskin. Michael is a widely respected academic economist with broad experience in government. He's been on the faculty at Stanford University since 1971, and he now holds the T.M. Friedman Chair in the Department of Economics and is a senior fellow at the affiliated Hoover Institution. Most of his research has focused on public finance, in particular the Social Security system and I would say, summarizing 150 academic articles, the impact of tax incentives on economic productivity and growth. Probably from your perspective, the most important thing he's done is he was the chairman of the Council of Economic Advisors under the elder Bush for all 4 years, which is probably a record too. Because these days it's a revolving door job. And let me mention one other thing he did since then, which is really about public policy, which I found particularly interesting. In 1996, he chaired the Bipartisan Commission on the Study of the Consumer Price Index. Sounds kind of boring, but in fact it's really pretty important stuff. And among the conclusions of that committee is a real economist conclusion, which is, contrary to what you may think, the Consumer Price Index significantly overstates the rate of inflation, which I always thought was a really neat conclusion, even if you guys don't believe it. He's now a member of a small team of economists who is advising John McCain. Now, on my right and your left, representing Senator Obama, is Leo Hindery. And he's had a long, distinguished career as an executive in the telecommunications industry. Until 1999, he was the CEO of AT&T Broadband, which is, or was, I keep reorganizing things, was AT&T's video, local television, internet services operation. Subsequent to that, he was the CEO of the Yes Network, which is the television home of the New York Yankees. And since 2004, he's been a managing partner of Intermedia Partners, which I quote from the resume because it's a mouthful, a media industry private equity manager. Okay, I think he wheels and deals. Is that fair?
That's fair.
On the political front, he served as a senior economic policy advisor to John Edwards in his run for the president, and these two folks were on the same platform debating each other when Leo was representing John Edwards. He's now an economic and trade policy advisor to Barack Obama. By agreement among the two participants, Leo's going to start. He's going to have 6 minutes to say his piece, and then Michael's going to have 6 minutes to say his piece, and then we'll get into it. Leo.
I think I'm going to echo, too, if you turn that down. I'm reluctant to call this a debate, too, because if it is, I'm going to get my butt kicked. Michael Boskin was actually representing, I think, Rudy Giuliani when we debated, isn't that right? And so it's the fickleness of politics. I started with John Edwards and moved over to Barack in February, where he was kind enough to forgive me for my transgression, and Michael roughly the same. My background, as you can tell, is a much different one than Michael Boskin's. It's been a pleasure to debate him in the past, and I certainly want to thank Mike Cloud and Mike Milken, who can't be with us tonight, and Peter for their generosity in hosting the two of us. My background, as you can tell, is much more that of a corporate executive. I'm in the commerce economy side of this economy. It's really that perspective that I think informs Barack Obama as this campaign draws to a close. It's his sense of fairness around a full and fully employed and fair economy that I think informs him and instills in me the loyalty I have towards him. Barack speaks often of a shattered contract with the middle class. It's the foundation for all of the policies and perspectives that we'll speak about this evening. And for him, the saddest evidence of how shattered that contract is that today 0.2% of the American taxpayers earn half of our nation's income, and the other 99.8% earn the other half. And he believes that the best thing for this economy and for this nation is a fair, full, and fully employed, vibrant middle class that grows from the bottom up. You'll hear him speak about that often, that concept of growing the middle class from the bottom up. He also believes in the tragedy that we find ourselves in now, this fallen economy, that such an economy that he describes as the only one that's likely to make valuable the hundreds of billions of dollars of securities that our government is acquiring on our behalf. This is a deeply troubled U.S. economy, and Barack feels that it will recover quicker and grow quicker with a true manufacturing policy, with public infrastructure investments of the sort that will also help create jobs, with additional government oversight, with a much more measured embrace of free trade, and a much fairer tax system. I've known John McCain for 20-plus years, and in contrast, my sense is that he actually believes, despite these troubled times, that we actually need today less regulation, even more unfettered free trade, and a continuation of lower taxes on the wealthy and on capital. Barack's tax plan, as many of you have heard, primarily revolves around very simply returning and reversing back to the Clinton-era levels the 2001-2003 cuts in taxes of income, capital gains, and dividends that went to the 5% of individual taxpayers and households who earn more than $200,000 on the individual level and $250,000 at the household level. He would keep in place the tax cuts that were proffered in 2001 and 2003 for the remaining 95%, which notably, and it's an important notable, which notably includes 98% of all small businesses. This single difference between the two candidates would result in an additional $120 billion of tax revenues that would come back into the system at a time when we obviously desperately need them. John McCain, as you have also heard, and we'll hear from Michael tonight, wants to keep in place all of the tax cuts, including for the top 5% households and individual taxpayers. And importantly, on top of that, he would reduce the corporate income tax from 35% to 25%, even though we know that U.S. corporate taxes as a percentage of GDP are 15% lower today than the OECD average, and despite the fact that this single change would cost us around $200 billion annually, again at a time when we can least afford it. An organization that a lot of us rely on is a nonpartisan organization called the Tax Policy Center. It is literally a nonpartisan event. In trying to individualize and calculate the implications of these plans, they have suggested that 95% of all American households and 98% of all small businesses would pay less tax under Senator Obama than they do today. The bottom 80% would pay materially less, and only the top 5% would pay more. The further calculation is that the impact on the federal budget of these two plans, Barack's would cut the federal budget deficit by around $748 billion by 2018. Senator McCain's would actually go the other direction, add around $750 billion, a roughly $1.5 trillion swing in the period ending 2018. Let me just close by commenting on one issue, which is also a sharp distinction between these two individuals, and that has to do with trade. Senator Obama does not believe that globalization has to mean more job insecurity, more stagnant wages for workers, and little or no health coverage for 75 million Americans. He also is deeply concerned about the offshoring of jobs that our trade policies have led to, roughly 3.7 million manufacturing jobs since 2000 and about 1.5 million service jobs. He's a strong believer in trade bringing benefit to employees as much as it does to corporations, and most notably is adamant that the one-size-fits-all premise that has characterized trade agreements in this country for the last decade and a half has to cease.
Leo, I think I need to interrupt you. I think we will definitely have time to continue that if you like. I'll make sure to raise it. Michael, would you like to have your piece here?
Sure. Well, thank you, Peter. It's good to see you again. Leo, it's good to see you again. Even when I disagree with people's policies, I think it's important for democracy for people to take time out of their lives to work in the political process. Democracy is not a participation sport, so I'm glad to see you're advising Senator Obama. I want to say 3 or 4 just very brief introductory things. But before I do, I just want to say that, Leo, go back and check the calculation of the implied corporate tax revenue from the number you threw out. It would shock the IRS that it was collecting a lot, that it was supposed to be collecting 2 or 3 times more per year from corporate taxes than it is. So that number was off, but that's an aside. I want to just talk to you about how economies function, how they grow, and whether we want to have a much larger role of government in our economy, especially at a time when we're about to bridge to an era of many, many more people because of demography and the like, the baby boom retiring and so on. We're bridging to an era that's actually started this year because it's the first year of a baby boomer 62 and will receive Social Security benefits, where we'll have an ever-growing fraction of people who are receiving more in payments from the government than are receiving in taxes. And whether in anticipation of that, for whatever reason, however noble the goal, even though I think it would do a lot of economic harm, we want to dramatically increase the fraction of people getting more money from the government they're paying in taxes, as Senator Obama would. If you look around the world and ask who's done well over the last quarter century, even adjusting for business cycles and so on, the answer among the major economies is almost exactly in inverse order of the size of their governments. Continental Europeans have done worst, America's done best, Britain in between in both measures. What's at stake in the long term, if we were to move, not that Senator Obama would quickly take us there, I'm not suggesting that, but we'd be heading in that direction. What's at stake in European levels of taxation and regulation and government spending is a 30% lower standard of living than we have in the United States. Forever. Every year. Permanently. This would be radically more harmful to the economy than even a severe recession. So those are the stakes, and that's what you ought to be thinking about as the big picture we're talking about here. That's number one. In the short term, we're in a recession. The slide is steepening, sadly, because of the credit crunch and the financial panic that we've been in. It's going to be more severe than the 2001 and 1990 recessions, which were, as recessions go, relatively brief and quite mild. As recessions go, they're always painful. It differs. California was hit very hard in the early 90s, for example, especially Southern California, Northern California, Silicon Valley worse in 2001. It would be a tragedy of unmitigated proportions, in my opinion, for the future of our society and our economy, for the type of economy and society we bequeath to our children and grandchildren. I'm not going to be around 30 or 40 years from now to worry about it, or I'll be at the tail end of my bocce ball or whatever. But the fact of the matter is, it makes a real big difference whether we're going to bequeath them a dynamic society, a dynamic economy that grows, offers upward economic mobility not only to most of us, but to those who haven't yet made it on the economic ladder. A key to that will be keeping tax rates, particularly marginal tax rates, relatively low, government spending carefully targeted, efficient, and to keep regulation doing what it needs to do and not trying to micromanage the economy. We certainly need better regulation in financial services. We've gone badly off board there, and it goes back to previous administrations and much of what they did, as well as some things that have occurred more recently. I'll be happy to talk about that later. But the big picture here is Senator McCain stands for lower tax rates. Leo talked about the corporate tax and his statement about the share of corporate income, but since we are less corporate as society, have a much more small business, et cetera, corporate income is a smaller fraction of our income than it is in many of these other countries, and that's why corporate income taxes are a lower share, even though our rate is the second highest in the industrial world in a global economy where we're competing. Leo made a lot, and Senator Obama makes a lot about discussion about trade. In the primaries, he was blazingly protectionist and had some really radical, dangerous ideas like unilaterally tearing up NAFTA. This is a man who wanted to improve our standing in the world. It's a great way to deal with our two closest neighbors, our only countries we border on. We're going to tell them, too bad about a treaty we negotiated that by and large has worked tremendously well, by the way. The environment's better on the Rio Grande. Wages and incomes and unemployment have been much better in the 14 years after NAFTA than the 14 years prior, either below or above the Rio Grande. So there certainly are pockets you can point to of distress. There's certainly been cost with these policies. But the syllogism that the cause of our current economic problems, some of which are longer standing, some of which are quite recent in terms of the recession in the financial system, is primarily because of the role of our government in our society, and that higher taxes, higher tax rates, taking a massive amount of additional people off the tax rolls, paying for the general payment of our government, I think would be a tragedy. Senator Obama's proposal would increase from 38% to 48% the fraction of Americans who do not contribute to the general cost of government at all. And I think that would be a tragedy. It would hasten and probably cement the move to a point where a majority of voters would be collecting more from the government than they were paying in taxes, which is a very unhealthy political dynamic in a democracy. Witness the stagnation in Western Europe for the last quarter century. Witness what went on in eastern cities in the 1970s and 80s, and still goes on in many of them today. So we live in a dynamic economy. We have great opportunities, like the modest role of government, limited government, capitalist, democratic model has been the greatest source of improvement in the human condition in human history. And while there are some rough edges that need to be improved, and while there are some changes that need to be made, including in regulation of financial services, we don't need to start a dramatic change of higher tax rates, penalizing success, reducing incentives to produce, grow, and expand the economy. In the misguided, let me just finish this one sentence, in the misguided notion that that has been the cause, that these lower tax rates have somehow been the cause of the slower growth of middle-class incomes than people would like. Happy to explain why that's occurred, but I think that's a totally erroneous analysis. And I'll end there.
Leo, if you guys want to go back and forth a bit, please go ahead, and then I'll start asking some questions.
Well, let me just a little bit. We have more income inequality in this country today than in any year since 1928. That's a fact. We have, every 3 years since 1981, the bottom 80% of our society has lost, in real terms, $100 billion of income, and the top 20% have gained $100 billion. We have 0.2% of this nation making half of our income, and 99.8% making the other half. These are verifiable statistics of a country in enormous distress. And Michael describes a world that I don't see out there, nor does Senator Obama. Let me just give you one quick anecdote or a number, Peter, if I might, on NAFTA. NAFTA's been around since 14 years. NAFTA was purported to bring trade balance between ourselves and Mexico. Cumulative trade deficit in 14 years, United States to Mexico, $454 billion deficit to Mexico. That has cost at least 1 million jobs out of this economy. It's this premise that everything is rosy as you listen to Michael, and it's not.
I started out by...
Let me finish. We have trade deficit.
Don't just misstate what I said, that's all.
We have trade deficit, we have current account deficit, we have federal deficit, all of unprecedented proportion, and we have the most income inequality in the United States since 1928. That's a fact.
Michael.
Income has certainly become less equal. Leo's using some data that I think are quite misleading, but it's certainly true that income's become less equal. It's been more concentrated at the top. I don't dispute that. However, if you look at it another way, what's happened to the incomes of people, and we take what used to be thought of as the typical definitions of low income, middle class, and higher income, that would be true in the west side of Los Angeles, but in much of America it would, below a real income of $25,000 20 years ago, now adjusted for inflation, so it'll be quite a bit higher, 25 to 70, it's 25 to 100 and over $100,000, you'd find that the fraction of people in the middle certainly has declined, but the fraction of people above $100,000 has risen more than the fraction of people below. So there's been general upward mobility, but there's more inequality. There's no doubt about that. It is an issue. It's certainly an issue. I'm not debating that at all. The economy, as I said, is in a steep recession, and we have other issues, from our current account issues to the deplorable state of some parts of our K through 12 education system in terms of long-run issues, and a variety of other pressing issues. It's the analysis of how we got there and what to do about it, and it's the populist kind of reaction to it. If Leo had his way, we would have a trade balance with every other country in the world, right? That would be a great thing. We'd have no trade. If you look at trade, there are imbalances everywhere. We have a large current account deficit on aggregate. That's an issue. But there's no reason we should have balance. To think of, it's economically illiterate to think that the appropriate standard of trade between any two countries is balance when you're in a multilateral world. He doesn't tell you that exports to Mexico have boomed. That trade among the three NAFTA countries has more than tripled since NAFTA was passed. That it's generally helped expand our, a little bit, economy, and Mexico somewhat more because it's a much smaller economy to which the trade is more important. Certainly there are cases of individual harm. You could probably find a particular place where where jobs were lost because some stuff had shifted to Mexico. That's possible, it's certainly, but in the aggregate it's been a small benefit to the American economy and a modest benefit to Mexico.
But I think
that aside, I do think we have to get back to how the economy is supposed to grow when we have a vast expansion of the government in healthcare, a vast expansion of the government, the same kind of micromanagement and misguided social engineering of the housing market that just blew up and is helping to cause the recession is in the books a decade from now in the proposals for the government to basically be playing a much larger role in healthcare, pharmaceuticals, and energy. The same kind of mandates, taxes, I know what's best, we'll do this, and things that can't possibly be commercially viable in the long term will cause the same kind of blow up down the road. It sounds good now, it just doesn't hold up to any serious analysis.
Let's give you a chance here, if you want.
Well, again, Michael describes a world that's unbroken, and I'm describing a world that is broken. We have 47 million Americans with no health insurance. We have another 25 million Americans, according to Kaiser, who are chronically underinsured. That's 75 million. It's not as if we're doing well in health care. It's not as if we're doing well in energy. Geez, the government may break the energy picture. It's broken. It's broken. The thing that I find so distressing about the way we say that exports to Mexico have soared, sure they've soared, but imports have soared $454 billion more than the soaring of the exports. There's never the second half of the answer. The real number is $454 billion trade deficit with Mexico. I don't care about the exports to Mexico. I care about the balance with Mexico because it was purported to be in balance. We are the only developed nation in the world that has a consistent, persistent trade imbalance. It's running $800 billion a year. It ran $800 billion last year, it will run $800 billion this year, and it will run $800 billion next year if we don't fix it.
Michael, do you want to respond to the...
Well, first of all, Senator Obama said absolutely nothing about that would have any impact on fixing it. Most of his policies would probably make it worse on balance despite his concern about it. That's number one. Number two, who here has purchased something that's been imported in the last year? Anybody who hasn't? Aren't you glad you're able to have that variety, that choice, those lower costs? So it's not like imports are all damaging, Leo. Come on, we live in a global economy.
We also live in a global economy in which the sovereign wealth fund aggregation is approaching $11 to $12 trillion. When you ship $800 billion a year overseas consistently, it adds up to enormous imbalances in wealth by sovereign nations.
Let me intervene here for a second, because I think you guys go at cross purposes a bit.
Yeah.
Do either of you want to talk about what you do? Is the trade deficit or the current account deficit an issue that requires a public policy intervention, and if so, what should that intervention be?
Well, the trade deficit, I think any serious economist would tell you, is primarily a reflection of global saving and investment balances, not of however many unfair trade practices there may be out there, and there certainly are some. If we clean them all up, it would have a trivial impact. Maybe we shouldn't allow stuff that's illegal or untoward, but it would have a trivial impact on our trade balance. It's primarily that we're a low-saving country, and the rest of the world had a saving glut and wanted to invest here, and we were happy to have that investment, have them help finance that investment because it helped our economy grow and increase productivity. So we need to save a bit more, not right now because of the recession, but over time, both publicly and privately. And the rest of the world will be consuming more from places like China and things of that sort. The Chinese are now trying to figure out how to stimulate consumer spending. And that's a natural adjustment that has to occur, but it has the notion that the $800 billion is the result of some trade things or of NAFTA is numerically illiterate.
Leo, take one more shot, and then we'll move on.
Numerically illiterate. The trade deficit with China alone is $350 billion each year. It includes no natural resource imports into this country. It is all manufactured goods. China is a chronic abuser of subsidy and currency manipulation that is simply impossible to refute. That's $350 billion each year. We have in this nation today, if you count people who are employed part-time of necessity or marginally employed, our actual unemployment rate today is 10.96%. This is a condition we can no longer live with. This income inequality, this embedded unemployment, and perpetual trade balances, it's an unsustainable combination. And I would simply go back to the premise that I proffered at the onset as to how Barack Obama Peter sees this. He sees this as a shattered contract with the middle class that has resulted in more income inequality since the first year that statistic was calculated, which is 1928. Michael seems to take and accept that inequality as just a consequence of these economic policies. It's an intentional outcome. None of this should come as any surprise to anybody that we're in the predicament we are with the trade policies and the economic and tax policies we have.
Okay, very short.
We can go back and forth. Find a reputable economist that will agree with that analysis, and I'll kiss you. Okay? There certainly are, as I said, there certainly are bad trade policies. There certainly are advantages. They are not unimportant, but they are not the major reason we have a large current account deficit. They're not the major reason for these flows of capital and goods.
Let me focus this on a subject which I suspect all of you want to hear about, which is the financial crisis and, in broad terms, where the candidates stand on a bunch of issues. What I thought I'd do is ask our participants here to spell out the areas in which they think their candidate is likely to be prepared to intervene once they're president, if I might. Let's start with the first one. Do we think a broad fiscal stimulus is appropriate at this point? Michael, you start.
I think it depends on what it is. I think that the first fiscal stimulus we had this spring had a very small impact on consumer spending for a few months at a fairly high cost. So just doing that again, I think, wouldn't do a whole bunch. I think the parties are very badly divided on the best way to go about stimulating the economy. I think the discussion on the second fiscal stimulus coming from Capitol Hill, from the Democrats who control Capitol Hill, is a large increase in government spending. Some of that may be justifiable on various humanitarian grounds, like extending unemployment insurance, for example, which I would support. But a lot of it, for example, infrastructure. There certainly are infrastructure needs. I'm not saying there aren't. There certainly are. But do you believe that we put out a lot of money and it would, number one, be spent quickly and hence useful in the current downturn, and that the projects that were chosen would pass serious national cost-benefit tests? I think you'd have to be dreaming for either of those two things. Chairman Bernanke said the same thing in his testimony when he said he'd be in favor of doing some things. So I think it's possible to do that in a way that would be helpful. I think, I think it's probably inevitable given the political dynamics that we're going to do it. But I would not be encouraged if it followed the path of the first one.
Leo.
I think some is in order. Senator Obama has signed on, Peter, with vigor to the $300 billion that's being put forward today. He believes that it should be substantially targeted at infrastructure. I disagree with Michael. I think that is the most immediate jobs-creating stimulus we could do. I think that in a credit-impinged society, short-term stimulus of the sort we saw last spring, Michael's right. I think it has important effect, but it's not long-term. It's not even medium-term. And we do have some crises developing in states. Roughly $100 billion of the $300 billion that's being suggested this time around would be directed at state and state imbalances and at things like unemployment extension and stamps, food stamps for the impoverished.
If I was of the opinion that you could quickly get the infrastructure project spending done and it was stuff that made sense, I'd be in support of it. The actual process by which the federal government does that suggests that the spending peaks about 3 years after the funds are put out.
Okay, let's move on.
So that's 2 to 3 years. So that's an issue whether that could really do a lot of good for the next 3 quarters.
Would our candidates support significant intervention in the mortgage market in terms of refinancing mortgages that are failing or foreclosed?
Senator McCain has proposed using some sizable fraction, $300 billion of the $700 billion that has been appropriated for targeting mortgages and refinancings. I think that many economists, from Marty Feldstein to Alan Blinder, to take prominent people in both parties, have suggested that doing targeting on that part of the problem in addition to what else is being done would help deal with the problem. The problem heavily rests, maybe the epicenter was really in the housing market, in the tremendous bubble in housing. Housing prices went up 50% more than personal income in the last 5 or 6 years. So they're obviously going to have to fall quite a bit. They probably have some more to fall. And housing construction has ground to a very small number. And we're very likely to see housing continue to contract for a little while longer. So I think that Senator McCain supports it, and many people do. I think that there's kind of a multi-pronged effort going on now, dealing with trying to, by guarantees and insurance, direct capital injections, the previously voluntary and perhaps additional actions that may be taken on the mortgage side, and a variety of other things that are being done by the Fed and Treasury and through other parts of the government at their behest, are designed to get the plumbing of the financial system, the basic markets, reopened. There's a little bit of improvement in that so far. For those of you who know this jargon, the LIBOR-OIS spread has retraced about 40% of its spike after September 15th. That's a measure of stress in the financial markets. But it's going to take some time. The Treasury's new proposal to get the additional capital injected into the banks has requests for proposals due November 14th, and they have to be gone over, then money has to be let, et cetera. And I think the best we can probably hope for from that is to slow the inevitable contraction. I think banks won't massively increase their lending into a recession, but I think we can slow the natural contraction of lending. And I think that's what we're talking about here, is some damage control. I think it would be absolutely essential that when this is over, and we can argue when it would be over, that we get the government back out that the history of these things is that government has a proclivity in programs to stay for a long time, look for new missions, especially since there's going to be a vast inflow of funds when the Treasury gets taken out of the equity positions, when the loans are paid off, when et cetera. The Treasury is going to be receiving a vast inflow of funds, and the temptation will be to spend it on pet projects and new initiatives, which would be a disaster, in my opinion.
Leo, you got a shot at this issue about direct intervention in the mortgage market.
Well, if you recall, Senator Obama in March of this year put forward the number of $300 billion, which was rejected out immediately by Senator McCain. He most recently did put forward a $300 billion proposal, which would have bought at par from the failed institutions. Their mortgages would have had modest relief to the homeowner. There's many of us who believe on the Democratic side, led by Senator Obama, that the primary audience that needs addressing today is the distressed homeowner. It is not the institution that put the mortgage out there in the first place. So Senator Obama has a much more household-centric solution, Peter, than the one that Senator McCain has put forward. But I would finish by saying that you listen to Michael say that once we fix this, he'd like to see government pull itself back again. That's exactly how we got into the fix that needs fixing. This sense of deregulation that leaves the American taxpayer on the hook when it fails is fallacy and foolishness. If we are going to have securities outstanding in which the American taxpayer is ultimately going to be held liable for, then the American government, the federal government, has a role in both enhanced and greater regulation, and certainly the formation of vehicles, Peter, that can anticipate the problems that these kind of security programs generate.
I don't disagree with that last part, but I'd just like to ask Leo a question, and I'll give my answer, which is, what deregulation are you talking about?
Glass-Steagall in 1999, and the
so
rules. Let me finish.
Go ahead.
Let me finish, Michael. And in 2004, the SEC's total abject inattention to the buildup of securities lending in Wall Street.
Well, let's start with Glass-Steagall. President Clinton signed it. There were two parts of it. Remember, Glass-Steagall, Depression-era regulation, separated investment and commercial banks. That's how we wound up with a J.P. Morgan and a Morgan Stanley. Well, what did the change in 1999 do? It allowed commercial banks to acquire investment banks. How did the dominoes fall? In inverse order of their gross leverage ratio, and here's I'll half agree with Leo on the second part of this. Bear Stearns, 35%. Fannie and Freddie in the 30s. Lehman, 30. Morgan Stanley and Goldman Sachs were next. They were in the mid-20s, but they raised some capital and became commercial banks very quickly. What's instructive about that is it's not the investment banks that have been acquired by the commercial banks. They're still there. So I think it's pretty easy to make this statement. It just doesn't hold up to empirical reality. That's number one. Number two, the regulation Leo's talking about, which I think he's correct, that the SEC didn't do enough to control the leverage of investment banks, is part of an increase in regulation, not a decrease. It extended regulation from investment bank brokerage subsidiaries to the parent holding companies. And it did that because the Europeans were going to regulate them. And that was important to do. They didn't do it very well, and I don't disagree with that. They let leverage build up, and they let the investment banks measure their own capital in their own models, which is part of the problem that we've had. So we need to have a less fragmented, better regulatory system. There's no doubt about that. Any systemically important institution needs to rapidly disclose information about its balance sheet to the regulators, and they have to, in real time, be monitoring capital adequacy and prevent the kinds of things that were done.
Leo,
so I don't disagree with that, but I think this general notion that deregulation did this is just wildly wrong.
What part of $1.5 trillion of loss do you tolerate, Michael? I mean, you continue to speak as if this economy is just fine.
I'm not. Why do you say that? I've said we're in a steep recession. We've got serious problems. On and on. Why do you keep... The straw man's out the door, Leo.
The straw man is not out the door. The straw man is the individuals who proffered a deregulatory construct for our financial institutions that has cost us $1.5 trillion.
First of all, it hasn't cost the government $1.5 trillion yet. There's somewhat over $1 trillion out there. We don't know what the ultimate cost will be. It could be considerably less. When we did the RTC to deal with when we did the RTC to do the Resolution Trust Corporation to deal with the savings and loan, it acquired over $500 billion. The net cost to the taxpayers was $100 billion, $500 billion, $100 billion was the net cost. So we're going to get something back for that equity we've injected. Not all those loans are going to be bad, et cetera. So it's hard to say. So be a little more realistic in that regard. That aside, if we look at what went on, it was a lot of social engineering that contributed to this, not just deregulation. It was forcing banks to do certain types of lending. It was Fannie and Freddie. Who was trying to rein in Fannie and Freddie? Was it the Democratic left? It was free marketers trying to rein in Fannie and Freddie. So let's be clear that you can use these simple slogans, but we're not going to serve our candidates, whichever one will become president, and we have to hope that they will succeed to get the country out of the problems it's in. To help do that, we'll not be serving them well or the country well by having a faulty analysis and by using these straw men about, this stylized this or that. You don't see me here calling Senator Obama a socialist, and you're basically doing the opposite to me. So let's be clear. Senator Obama wants a larger role of government. In some limited cases in the financial regulatory area, I agree with it, based on a serious analysis of what the issues are, not just to throw something on that will wipe out many of the advantages of financial innovation. Who here has a mortgage? I know some of you have got issues with your mortgage. Well, mortgage-backed securities, which are a big part of this problem, help reduce the cost of those mortgages. So there are some benefits to financial innovation as well as the cost. Some things got out of control. They were not done well. I don't disagree with Leo on his critique of the SEC, for example, and there are other things I could point to. So we need smart, surgical, sensible regulation. We don't need a whole vast new bureaucracy of people running around trying to keep up with firms and products they can possibly understand.
Let me press Leo on this. I was an economic historian, and one thing that economists widely believe is that much of the New Deal regulation, long after the fact, turned out to be quite damaging. And it took a very long time to undo it, and the way it was damaging was that interest groups, the regulation became controlled by interest groups. And the interest groups were the people with the most money. Are you worried that we're going to repeat those kinds of errors at all in re-regulating the economy?
I'm not unrealistic. I think, Peter, that there is always the threat of over-regulation and mistakes being made. I think that the predicament we find ourselves in now begs for action. And none of us should believe that the government and its bureaucracy is always the most efficient solution. But we have to acknowledge that the predicament that we've dug ourselves into is so acute that some action is necessary, and mistakes will be made. But they will pale alongside the mistakes that have already been made and the cost to this economy for a decade that we're going to eat through. I think Michael is wrong in suggesting that the loss to this society, to this economy, I believe will, when it's all said and done, will be on the order of $1.5 trillion that will have, not from the federal government, Michael, but $1.5 trillion of loss will be absorbed by this economy in securities and home mortgages gone awry.
Do you want to respond to that? Because I'd like to press you about something else.
Yeah, we're in a recession. There's going to be a loss from that. We've already seen perhaps it will overshoot and come back at some point, but certainly there's some loss. The notion of taking everything from its peak and then down to the bottom and calculating that as a loss is an unusual standard. We certainly suffered losses. There certainly have been mistakes made, some in public policy, most of them private. And we certainly have improvement we can make. We just need to learn the right lessons from this so we don't repeat the mistakes that Peter referred to earlier that impose really large costs on the economy for a very long period of time. Remember a crash and a recession were turned into the Great Depression by tax increases, protectionism, and bad monetary policy. So just remember that when you're talking about tax increases and what can only be called soft-core protectionism.
Leo? Cumulative household net worth in the United States at the end of 2002 was $39 trillion. At the end of 2007, it was $59 trillion. That $20 trillion of accretion in 5 years' time, Peter, is an adjustment that we're going to have to swallow. Nobody should leave this encounter today believing that these numbers are small. We've seen market losses approaching $9 trillion so far. We've seen real household losses, people evicted from homes that approximate $1.5 trillion on top of that. All that has done is taken $59 trillion of cumulative household net worth down to 50. There's another $11 trillion that has to be adjusted into this system in some fashion or another over the next several years. These are enormous numbers, and the solution cannot be found in a continuation of the tax policies that, in my opinion, have contributed so mightily to this imbalance.
I'll come back to the tax policy. Leo, I love you dearly. There's no economic analysis that says that from its peak we have to get back to the 2002 level of net worth. There's no economic basis for that. It could be, we could wind up a little lower than now, a lot lower than now, well above where we were before. There are a variety of things. But measuring, a lot of this is the value of homes. And measuring the value of homes from a bubble is the same thing as measuring the NASDAQ from the peak of the tech bubble and say, this is how much we lost with the crash. It wasn't real in the first place. Some people were able to cash out early, and they won. And people who bought high at the end are suffering. That's a serious problem, and we're dealing with that in a variety of ways, and we should. But somehow talking about the tax policies, lowering the top marginal tax rate from 39.6% to 35%, reducing the dividend and capital gains rates, reducing the double taxation of dividends and capital gains because they've already paid corporate taxes, which are among the highest in the world, somehow is responsible for this fall is just insane. I mean, it's just, there's no economic rationale for that. Now, again, he's going to say that means that I am saying we don't have problems. Anybody here heard me say we don't have problems? We have serious problems. It's just the analysis is ridiculous that he's offering. You can argue that we should give up some growth, give up some standard of living to redistribute to lower income people. That's a legitimate argument and debate we should have. We can have different weights on those things. But to suggest it's costless or even more backwards that lower marginal tax rates hurt the economy is just nonsense.
Michael?
Senator McCain certainly doesn't believe that, and you shouldn't either.
Michael, let me press you. I gave Leo a slightly hard time. Let me give you a slightly hard time.
Good. Try.
If tax policy shouldn't be used at this point to redistribute incomes in the United States, is there any policy we can use to redistribute income? Are we stuck where we are now? Or let me put it another way. What drove most of the change in inequality, I think most economists agree, were a lot of factors really outside the purview of government. They were technological change, they were global integration. Are we not allowed to lean against the wind with tax policy? What can we do about, if we don't like it the way it is, in terms of the distribution of income, what can we do about it?
Senator McCain believes, and I certainly support this view, is that we ought to be working on giving people the skills to succeed in this economy, not just transfer them income in a way, by the way, that's going to raise their marginal tax rates in terms of the benefits they're going to lose when they come off of Senator Obama's half dozen or dozen new refundable credits as people start to work, they'll start losing some of those benefits, and they'll face among the highest tax rates and have among the least incentive to work harder and succeed in society. I think that's a misguided way to do it. I don't disagree with the noble intention, by the way, as I've said earlier, despite Leo's claims otherwise. But I just think that is not the way to do it. We need a much better education, particularly for the bottom half of our students who are not doing well in many of our public schools, are not living up to what they need to do. Obama and McCain have very different views about the role of charter schools and choice and so on, and trying to get some competition into the public schools to try to improve their ability. And Senator Obama is somewhat tied to a set of a way of thinking and a set of interests that is very much beholden to the public schools. We need better public schools. We also need competition for them to improve to the same way that our higher education system is the best in the world, because Stanford has to compete with a lot of other places, and UCLA has to compete with a lot of other places for students, for faculty, for grants, etc. That's why they're great, and we need to do much more in that regard. And there are many other things. Retraining people who are disemployed for some of the trade problems that Leo's pointing out. There certainly, as I said earlier, despite what he's been saying, as I said, there are some instances where people are displaced. It's not most of the problem, the reason we have a trade deficit, but it's a serious issue. If you're displaced, you're 100% displaced. You're not, a tiny fraction of 1% of the people that's been displaced. So we need much better trade adjustment assistance, much better government programs to help people retrain, and financial assistance to get that retraining, rather than 100 different bureaucratic programs throughout the government, which grew up historically by accident in different administrative agencies under the purview of different congressional committees, which have very little to do with actually getting people jobs in the real world, and better jobs, and getting back on their feet. Senator McCain wants to reform those things, and I think that's the right way to go.
Let me answer that.
Yes, Leo, let's make this the last comment, because I want to give you guys some time to ask some questions, okay? So let's make this the last comment from up here without your intervention.
The premise that you can educate your way and retrain your way out of this mess is a falsehood of the greatest order. That would be a multi-generational undertaking. It's one we should commit ourselves to with every possible resource. But the premise that we will educate and train ourselves out of this predicament, that we will reestablish income equality in this country by retraining and re-educating our population, it's one of the great head fakes in corporate America. And we used it all the time when I was more actively in that arena, which is, you fix your education system, America, and in the meantime, I'll keep offshoring jobs and deteriorating worker quality and compensation. Let me leave you with one perspective on the premise that education will take us out of this. 0.2% of American taxpayers earn half of the nation's income. 99.8% earn the other half. That is not a phenomenon that you can educate yourself out of in my lifetime or yours as well.
He keeps repeating these statistics. I just urge you to, I don't want to get into technical discussion. There's been an increase in inequality. It's more at the top than it used to be. It's substantial. He's overstating it. Let me just make one other point.
Very briefly.
If we look at what's actually happened with the tax cuts he blames for everything, the top 50% of taxpayers pay 97% of the income tax. The bottom 50% pays 2.9%, the lowest more or less in history. We've removed 30-something% of the population from income taxes. They get money, they either pay zero or get money back from the government. Not the refund of taxes you paid, but more than that, cash. Transfer payments. So Senator Obama calls them tax cuts, his new refundable credits. They're transfer payments. The budget's required to call the part where they send you a check spending. He calls it a tax cut, which is how he comes up with some of the exaggerated, the minimum, how he reduces the size of his tax increases and increases the number of people he's giving so-called tax cuts for. He's calling some transfer payments tax cuts. But aside from that, let me just make a really important point. Between 2000 and 2004, so the first year after the second round of tax cuts went into effect in 2003, including on dividend and capital gains, the share of taxes paid by the top 1%, the top 10%, the top 50% all went up more rapidly than their income went up. The income tax per se became more progressive. Now there are other taxes, there were still payroll taxes, et cetera. So, it sounds good. Deregulation, tax cuts, oh, those horrible Republicans that are just these free market nuts, I say. It all sounds kind of appealing in this populist nonsense. But it just happens to be factually inaccurate. Now, with respect, I do agree with one part of Leo. Let me just finish this last part. I do agree with one part, which is that training, you can train somebody this coming year who's just lost his job, but education will take longer. We can improve the lot of kids in school now with better things, but it will take a while for that to occur. So there certainly is a case for various types of assistance, but they should generally be safety nets. They should operate like a trampoline, not like a spider web. Okay?
Okay. Here are the ground rules, folks. Yeah, don't talk unless you've got a microphone in your hand, because we're webcasting this and nobody will hear you in the room either. That's first. Second of all, please no speeches, questions, okay? Who would like to ask a question?
We'll start over here. Thank you. First of all, I want to express my appreciation for the opportunity of hearing you both this evening. Whenever a politician tells me that he's here to create fairness, there's a hair that stands up in the back of my head. And I wonder if we can agree at least on one issue this evening, and I appreciate your perspective on that issue. Who, in your view, was responsible for directing Freddie and Fannie to lower their underwriting standards? And who, in your view, was responsible for preventing the kind of regulations with respect to that underwriting and the securitizations that exacerbated it, that in large measure people believe was responsible for what's happened recently?
Who'd like to go first?
I'm happy to, if you'd like. I mean, as the economist. Leo, if you want to, you're welcome to go first. I don't care.
No, you go ahead.
Suddenly
First, I would say there are the conflation of several simultaneous events, forces, public policies, trends led to this. It's going to take a minute to go through them. First, this wasn't the main course here, but monetary policy was way too loose for too long. We had negative real interest rates for several years in a growing economy. What does that mean? Is you're subsidizing borrowing. You're paying back in cheaper dollars than you're borrowing in. That led to an explosion of borrowing and lending. And it wasn't just in subprime mortgages and securitization. There are people here in the private equity industry, including Leo, all those high multiple private equity deals that were financed with lending with no max and no covenants were partly the result of this atmosphere. Now, it was done brilliantly lowering interest rates to 1% in 2001 to help cushion the recession. So give Alan Greenspan credit for that. And he wanted to insure against the Japanese-style deflation after the tech bubble burst. Give him credit for that. But he wound up over-insuring. Okay? With respect to Fannie and Freddie, there's blame to go around on many quarters, but the people that it was free market types that tried to rein it in. I tried to do that when we did the RTC to deal with the S&Ls. I was told you're not going to get an S&L bill if you go after Fannie and Freddie to try to control their balance sheets. So there's plenty of blame to go around. And President Clinton, noble attention. You have to appreciate where he was coming from in this. He didn't anticipate the consequences. Had a program to radically increase home ownership to over 70% to get a lot more low and low-middle income people into homes. Noble intention. Caused a lot of things to go on in a lot of parts of government. It's not just Democrats, though. The Bush Jr. HUD, he wanted to have an ownership society. Good idea. Sounds good. Great. But what happened was they came up with a fabulous new innovation. We're all for innovation, entrepreneurship, right? They came up with a no-money-down mortgage. So we had a no-money-down mortgage, which morphed into the no-money-down, no-income verification mortgage. At low starter teaser rates, you fill in your income that you need that we'll tell you about, and you just write it in, and we won't verify it. And there are a lot of other things, poor governance, lax diligence, some fraud, probably on some mortgage originators and some borrowers, some potential homeowners. All that kind of blew up, and that's what I was referring to about the social engineering. Good intentions. Senator Obama has good intentions, I'm sure, for some of his social engineering schemes in energy and health and so on. There are problems. You just have to be careful how you do it, or you wind up with really, really bad consequences later that you don't anticipate. I think some of them can be anticipated. It's not that he's not trying to deal with an actual problem. I certainly easily grant him that.
Leo?
Let me try to do it in less than 6 minutes. I think that the Fed was irresponsible in its loose interest policies. I think everybody believes now that was the ultimate driver. I think it was substantially compounded by letting quasi-government and public institutions, Fannie and Freddie, through lobbying efforts, morph into essentially private institutions while still holding the U.S. taxpayer and the U.S. economy hostage to their failings. I think that we took semi-public institutions and, again, through lobbying, essentially privatized them to everybody's tragedy today. I think that should never be repeated, particularly when it's obvious that the American taxpayer is the recourse at the end. But I think it started with loose practices by the Fed that should have, to Michael's comment, stopped right after the 01 recession intervention. It persisted, and if you read Alan Greenspan's memoirs and otherwise, you see a very libertarian sense of low-interest, non-interest activity that persisted through almost an entire decade.
By the way, Leo will be happy I say this. I would add some of the bank regulators, when it became public knowledge that people who couldn't qualify for an auto loan were getting mortgages, they should have done something about it.
Good afternoon.
The microphone's there. Please, go ahead.
Thank you. Good afternoon. I have a question for both of you, and I'm a person who's a Democrat, but I vote Republican and Democratic in presidential elections. I've heard both sides this afternoon and in the campaign talk about trade deficits, and both sides talk about budget deficits. A week or two ago in one of the debates, the candidates were both asked, how would you ask the American people to sacrifice? And I was greatly disappointed that neither of them would tackle, and I want to ask you for a reason why. Neither of them will say something like, and it doesn't even have to be couched in terms of sacrifice, of being more wise with gasoline. Both parties have said, well, we're sending $700 billion a year overseas for oil. So if one of the candidates, God forbid, would say, you know, if you have two cars, use the one that's more gas efficient, not his or hers. Make sure your car is well-tuned. Make sure your tires are inflated. Perhaps this would help both the trade deficit, and then people would have more money in their pockets because the price of oil and gasoline would come down, and there'd be more to spend. But neither of the candidates seem to be willing to take a leadership position and ask the American people to participate in something so simple as using gasoline more efficiently.
Okay, to the point of what kind of sacrifices should politicians be asking for?
Let me answer this, gentleman. I think it would be a good thing if people in the public domain, not just presidential candidates, the incumbent president, encourage people to economize, to be more efficient in the use of energy. I think that would be a good thing. I think it would not add, it would help a little, but it's not the bulk of what now is roughly half of that $700 billion in current oil prices. It's more like 350, but it's not going to be a large fraction of that, but it would help. And I think there are other things that are going to have to be done. Senator McCain has said we're going to have somewhat less government spending, that he's going to go through a variety of things. He's going to slow the growth of entitlement outlays. He's going to get together with everybody. He's left everything on the table. Oh, he would prefer to do it on the spending side, and would do Social Security first and then Medicare. Senator Obama has said about Social Security he'll look first to revenues. He's already proposed some tax increases and breaking the traditional tying of Social Security benefits and taxes to make it more explicitly into a welfare scheme rather than a social insurance scheme, although he's only going to do that for high-income people. He also has said he ruled out any increase in retirement ages in the distant future over at least the next 50 years, which means, amongst other things, he's promising that your grandchildren in high school today can retire at the same age you're going to and collect Social Security, even if life expectancy goes up 10 years by then.
Leo?
you want us to answer each other, or do you want to answer us the question?
Let's answer the question about politics and
we can do
sacrifice.
Social Security if you want. I'm happy to do that. I don't know where that took off.
Controlling spending.
That's not what he asked. He asked about cafe standards and gasoline utilization. That's what he asked about.
Leadership from the...
I said, you asked what would he ask people to sacrifice? They're going to have less government.
And they got 3 minutes on Social Security. Do you want to do Social Security?
Hey guys,
one example.
Hey guys, I'm in charge. Answer the question.
Senator Obama has been quite outspoken as part of his energy policies on higher cafe standards, which is the only alternative structurally that can address the gasoline usage that you speak about. All of these individuals, I think Senator McCain and Senator Obama, are very much of a mind that jawboning out of the presidential office is something that will come from either one of them. I don't have any sense that either of these gentlemen is unaware of the need for conservation and changes of behavior, but the only structural change that's going to have any impact on gasoline is a higher cafe standard.
I think in terms of your question about what general sacrifices he's going to ask people, like what they're going to do less with as we move into the future, then current projections, not the now, but the current projections of that gobbling up the whole budget and all of GDP. He's been very explicit. Senator Obama has not, other than he's going to raise taxes on, quote, the rich.
That's not true. Senator Obama has been consistent on a concept called pay-go. Every proposal that Senator Obama has put forward is paid for to the penny. There's no leakage whatsoever in any proposal that he's put forward, and not finding a revenue equivalent for that.
Look, let me just make this one point. It's a presidential election. There's a certain amount of hyperbole. That's not factually accurate. All candidates, Republican and Democrat, take some liberty with the numbers when they're running. I'll grant that.
Will each of you comment on the greed and avarice that we're experiencing and what role that plays? We find ourselves in this theater of the absurd. Now we're asked to, rein in and be very careful and change our lifestyles and so forth and so on, which in itself is not so bad. But could you comment on the greed and the avarice that we're experiencing?
I think that if you're honest about the predicaments that we find ourselves in, and Senator Obama has spoken about this, that you'll find that excess compensation is at the root of much of these evils. We have a circumstance today, apples to apples, where the average public company chief executive in the United States earns roughly 400 times what his or her average employee makes. Apples to apples, that number for a century was in the 15 to 20 range. And it exploded over the last 15 years to an unconscionable level. It's manifest as well in the compensation schemes associated with the financial securities industry, the manner of compensation. There is some attempt in these bailout efforts to go after that, but a much more elaborate attention needs to be paid, and Senator Obama has spoken about this, to the excess compensation. You can call it greed, I do, and that has led to much of these outcomes. The offshoring of jobs, the cutting of benefits, the tolerance of income inequality, the compensation schemes that, again, that led to the travails of Wall Street. I think it's all compensation.
Michael.
Well, I'll just make a more general point, which is that human beings are human beings. 7 deadly sins exist. And I think when we analyze, when we put in public policies, we analyze what's going on privately, we have to realize that those things will exist. And this subsidized borrowing with negative real interest rates and a variety of these other trends fed into people doing what they will do in that environment. When they see that it can be tremendously rewarding, they'll push it. And I certainly would agree. I doubt many people stood up in some of these institutions and said, we've got to stop doing, forgetting about whether you think of it as greedy or avarice, we've got to stop doing this because the music's going to stop and it's going to be really damaging. We've got to stop making a lot of money right now.
Michael, let me press you. Would you use either direct regulation or tax incentives to try to reduce executive compensation?
No, but I think that corporate boards should be the place that's decided. And I think people can, I think the market will start to regulate it in various ways. I think we need to reward people that are doing really well. And I think that we need to have compensation schemes that have, I think part of the problem has been that some of the people in this chain that were that had compensation schemes like mortgage originating officers that were kind of one of the people have complained about, sets of people have complained about, were not getting paid by how this did down the road. So much of what's happened in this compensation, and some of the thing that Leo somewhat overstated, but he's pointing to something that's a correct trend, of the big increase in incomes at the top or CEO compensation, has been that a much larger fraction of it's variable and has been an equity compensation, pushed, by the way, by things like pension funds, et cetera, who wanted the CEOs to have their well-being tied to what they're doing. And so with stock options and restricted stock, the ones that have done well have cashed in and have done very well. But that, I think, is not something that we ought to see the government directly regulating. I think we ought to put, I think that's going to be happening in any event. It's starting to happen in how corporate compensation committees of boards work.
Senator Obama has a very specific shareholder Bill of Rights proposal that would embolden shareholder governance, their oversight in an advisory role of compensation, which would make the legal culpability of boards much more apparent. He has also gone further to say that he is prepared to use the tax code to stop the abuses that even that shareholder Bill of Rights won't correct.
One of the things that's happened is the attempt to use the tax code has made it worse. So we put a limitation of $1 million on the pay, the tax deductibility of pay of CEOs. So what's happened is more and more of the pay got, the part that wasn't tied to performance, that wasn't tied to things like stock prices. So more and more got shifted out of compensation because it was now direct wages, compensation, salary, because it was going to not be tax deductible, and shifted into equity. And for those people whose stock prices went up, that was a big gain. So you know, this all sounds good, but often, not always, there's certainly an important role for government to play in many of our institutions and many aspects of life. But often when government tries to do these things, it doesn't, to be generous, get it quite right.
I can't see where the lights are there. Okay, fine.
Thank you. I have a question on trade. It's really popular to talk about manufacturing more stuff here and bringing jobs here, and I think that's a noble idea, but I've never heard a candidate mention the fact that if more stuff is made here, it's going to cost more at Walmart, and I'm pretty sure if you polled 100 consumers, none of them want to pay more for their jeans or any other products that are currently made in China. Could you address that?
I'd be delighted. It's very evident that we've passed the tipping point when lower prices, which are a benefit to society, have been subsumed and overwhelmed now by the cost of the lost employment and the stagnant wages that our trade imbalance is causing. There's some very good analysis which we're happy to share with you outside of this. It's quite elaborate. But we clearly went past the tipping point. Everybody is cognizant of lower prices from imported goods. When they rise to such an excess that jobs are lost in the millions, and when wages stagnate and benefits decline for the remaining part of your workforce, that's a tipping point, and we're delighted to show you some of that stuff if it's helpful.
Michael?
It's important to make one important point. There certainly are puts and takes, costs and benefits, and the lower prices are a big benefit. They've been immensely important. They're shared widely. And by the way, most importantly, among lower income people who need those lower prices more. But there certainly is some labor disruption. Now, when Leo talks about lost jobs, and when some politicians talk about jobs they're going to create with their schemes, you have to understand they're confusing gross and net jobs. Certainly some people who have lost their jobs for whatever reason, technology, trade, most of the growth in manufacturing productivity has been technology, not trade, but trade has contributed, that most of those people find other jobs. Some of them aren't nearly as well paid. There's a big social loss there. It's very difficult, hence the need to get better training so they can get better jobs. But you can't just take all, the fact is, well, we're in a recession now. If we look at the average unemployment rate for the 14 years after NAFTA, or the last 5 years, it's relatively low by historical standards. People were getting jobs, were creating lots of jobs. Incomes rose, not as much as we'd like them to. But again, so the analysis is a little more subtle and a little less this kind of, the initial emotional cut at it's a little misleading.
On that note, guys, I believe...
Peter,
Yeah.
I think we have time for one more question. This
If we
gentleman
do,
right
by
here.
all means.
Right up here.
Hello. One of the things I've been struck by as I've watched the blame game go on, as inevitably will, is how seemingly little some of the senators and representatives on these committees that have been parading everybody up in front of them have actually known about the actual problem and the questions that they've been asking, just how seemingly little they know. So my question is out of each of your campaigns, what, if any, discussion is going on along those regards rather than trying to create legislation in words that guide all of our behavior? What about just having our regulators be more accountable and the senators and representatives know more about what's going on?
Who wants to handle that?
I think that would be a good thing. By the way, I think that I'm sure both campaigns try. Both Senator Obama and Senator McCain try to understand the issues. They meet with advisors. They try to do that and get some analysis. Both have talented people advising them. They're leaving me aside. There are a variety of issues that come up in that context, and of course now in the midst of the throes of the end of a long, long presidential campaign with the stakes so high and a lot of stuff's being driven by ads and so on and that forth, it isn't the easiest way to get a thorough analysis and understanding out into the public domain. But I would agree, I think it would be a good thing if there was better economics and business education of many people, of not only senators and congressmen, but many of the regulators. There are a lot of people that regulate institutions that have never had a job, including many senators and congressmen who've never held a job in the private sector. They've just been lawyers and in government their entire life. And that's true at the state level as well. When I was at the CEA, I proposed to Senior Bush a sabbatical program for regulators to spend a year in industry. He loved it, but then the lawyers started saying, well, they'll get accused of, revolving door and conflicts of interest, and that's certainly a legitimate concern. But I think both in the sense that Peter raised it earlier, that you can get regulation and the regulators can get captured by the industry they're trying to regulate and do some damage that way, and just by understanding what the ramifications, if they push on X, they might wind up getting Y instead. I think that would be a good idea.
On that note, I think I'm going to close this, though. Mike Clouden, I think, is going to say a word or two here.
Leo has one more thing he wants to say.
We agreed Leo didn't
He
want to.
tipped me off.
Good.
I'm going to stay quiet.
I've known you for a long time. That's really a remarkable statement.
I want this conversation to end with Michael Boskin.
That's all good. Well, let me just say this. It is not hyperbole nor campaign rhetoric to say that this has been an excellent conversation. I think we've all found it very worthwhile. And our thanks to you, Peter, to you, Leo, to you, Michael. We appreciate it, and we appreciate your service.
My pleasure.
Thank you, guys.